Engineers expected this. The mission design accounted for signal degradation, increasing latency and eventual loss as the craft moved beyond reliable communication range. This was not a flaw, it was the cost of distance. Every probe sent beyond the familiar boundaries of the solar system eventually meets the same fate. Its voice grows faint, then fragmented, then, by all conventional measures, gone. This has happened before. The Voyager probes still transmit today, but at data rates measured in bits per minute. Their signals are not conversations. They are whispers stretched across decades. New Horizons, now well beyond Pluto, already requires hours for simple command confirmation. These realities are not mysterious. They are physics. Radio signals spread, noise accumulates, power diminishes, and so when 3i Atlas began to behave strangely, no one panicked. At first, the early anomalies were subtle enough to be dismissed as calibration drift, minor irregularities in timing, unexpected fluctuations in signal strength that did not align perfectly with distance alone. Engineers recalibrated. Analysts cross-checked telemetry. Everything remained within acceptable margins of uncertainty. Space missions are full of small surprises. Most of them mean nothing. Then came the silence. By late 2024, according to internal mission timelines used in conceptual deep space studies, 3i Atlas ceased regular transmission. The carrier signal no longer maintained coherence. Error correction protocols failed more frequently than they succeeded. Telemetry packets arrived incomplete, their internal checksums invalid. This was not unexpected. In fact, it was almost anticlimactic. Mission controllers marked the event as a nominal loss of communication, archived the last complete dataset, and prepared the standard post-mission analyses. In public-facing summaries, the language was careful and restrained. The craft had exceeded its designed communication envelope. Its instruments would continue operating autonomously for some time, but no further meaningful data could be recovered. That should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. Because several weeks after the final confirmed transmission, something unusual happened. A faint signal appeared, not strong enough to reconstruct into usable telemetry, not coherent enough to qualify as a carrier wave, but persistent. And more importantly, it appeared where nothing should have been. The signal did not arrive as a continuous stream. It came in fragments, short bursts, each lasting only milliseconds, separated by long intervals of silence. These fragments did not conform to known failure modes. They were not echoes, they were not reflections, they were not solar interference. They were also not messages, at least not in any conventional sense. The recovered data packets, later referred to informally as whispers by analysts, contained structured irregularities, patterns in timing, repeated distortions at specific frequencies, variations that resisted classification as random noise. This did not mean intention, but it did mean structure, and structure demands explanation. To understand why this mattered, it helps to understand how space communication normally fails. When a spacecraft moves beyond effective range, its signal-to-noise ratio degrades smoothly. The data does not become strange, it becomes absent. Bits flip unpredictably, frames collapse. Eventually, nothing distinguishable remains. What analysts saw here was different. The fragments arrived too cleanly for noise, yet too broken for signal. They were neither, and that liminal quality, the space between categories, is where curiosity awakens. Now, before imagination outruns evidence, discipline must intervene. The first question engineers asked was not, what does this mean? It was what could cause this physically. Several hypotheses were tested. One possibility was delayed transmission. Space is vast, and radio waves travel at finite speed. Could these fragments be echoes of earlier transmissions, refracted or scattered by interstellar plasma? This happens. Charged particles can bend and distort radio waves, especially at low power. Another possibility involved onboard autonomy. Some probes are programmed to switch to low-power burst modes under specific conditions, transmitting minimal status pings long after main systems shut down. A third explanation was instrumental artifact. Earth-based receivers are imperfect. Atmospheric interference, hardware noise, and software filtering can all generate phantom patterns if not carefully controlled. Each of these explanations was plausible. None fully fit the data. The timing intervals did not match known burst mode programming. The frequency distortions did not align with plasma scattering models. The patterns persisted across multiple receiving stations, ruling out local interference. Importantly, no one suggested intelligence, not officially. The language used in internal discussions remained cautious. Anomalous persistence, non-random residual structure, unclassified signal behaviour. This was not sensationalism, it was restraint. Yet restraint does not erase implication, because when a signal refuses to behave like noise, it forces a deeper question. What defines noise? In physics, noise is randomness, unstructured variation without correlation. A signal, by contrast, exhibits regularity. Even degraded signals retain traceable order. What analysts were seeing sat uncomfortably between these definitions. Not enough order to decode, not enough chaos to dismiss. This in-between state is deeply unsettling to human cognition. We are pattern-seeking by nature. When confronted with ambiguity, we search harder, not slower. Ancient cultures responded to this impulse with myth. Modern science responds with models. Both are attempts to contain uncertainty. Now, step back for a moment. 3i Atlas was not built to detect intelligence. It carried no linguistics modules, no semiotic frameworks, no expectation of conversation. Its sensors were designed to measure matter, energy and motion, not meaning. So the question was, never is someone speaking. The question was far more modest. Why is something behaving differently than expected? And that question alone was enough to reignite attention. Data analysts began re-examining archived transmissions from the final weeks before silence. They looked for precursors, small deviations that might explain the later fragments, subtle timing shifts, frequency drifts, power fluctuations. What they found was not dramatic, it was gradual. The signal did not fail suddenly. It thinned. Its redundancy decreased. Error correction routines activated more frequently. Then, after silence, the fragments appeared. This suggested continuity, not interruption. Whatever produced the whispers was not new. It was a remnant. Now consider a parallel. When a star exhausts its fuel, it does not disappear instantly. It sheds material. It flickers. It emits weak radiation long after fusion ceases. Astronomers study these remnants not because they are alive, but because they preserve information about what once was. The same logic applies here. The whispers were not a message, they were an afterimage. But afterimages can still tell us something. Now comes the point where modern curiosity intersects ancient instinct. When early civilizations observed comets, eclipses, or strange celestial events, they did not assume communication. They assumed significance. Something had changed. The sky behaved differently. Patterns broke. Meaning followed observation, not the other way around. Modern audiences often invert this. They begin with meaning and search backward for confirmation. That is not what responsible inquiry does. Responsible inquiry asks, what conditions could produce this behaviour? And more importantly, What does this teach us about the limits of our expectations? One of the most valuable lessons of deep space exploration has been humility. Every probe teaches us how little we control, how slowly information moves, how fragile communication becomes beyond our technological cocoon. 3i Atlas, in this sense, did exactly what it was meant to do. It reached a place where our assumptions about communication no longer applied. The whispers were not a failure. They were a boundary, and boundaries are where knowledge begins. Still, the human mind resists leaving questions open. Even among professionals, speculation whispered quietly. Could unknown interstellar medium effects be at play? Could exotic plasma interactions be generating quasi-stable resonances? Could we be observing a phenomenon we lack vocabulary for? None of these required intelligence. All of them required patience. What matters most here is not what the whispers were, but how they were treated. They were logged, they were preserved, they were not explained away. This restraint is rare in popular discourse. It is also essential, because when evidence is thin, imagination must be thinner. Now, pause and reflect. Humanity has sent thousands of instruments into space. Most of them failed silently. A few lingered longer than expected, and some, like Voyager, continue transmitting long after their creators stopped listening closely. 3i Atlas joins this lineage, not as a herald, not as a messenger, but as a reminder that silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is a threshold, a place where expectation dissolves and observation must change. The whispers did not tell us we are not alone. They did not tell us we are being watched. They told us something far quieter, that our models of communication, like our myths of visitors, reflect our assumptions more than reality. And assumptions, once stretched far enough, begin to crack. As we move into the next segment, the focus will shift again, from the signal itself to our interpretation of it. Because the most important question raised by the whispers is not what sent them. It is why we were so eager to hear something in them at all. That question, once asked, cannot be unasked. Long before humanity learned how to transmit a radio signal, we learned how to listen for meaning. This instinct is older than technology, older than language, older than history itself. It begins with survival. Early humans learned that the difference between safety and danger often announced itself quietly. A shift in wind, a sudden stillness among birds, a rhythm breaking where rhythm had always been. Those who noticed survived. Those who didn't often didn't get a second chance. This shaped the human brain into something extraordinary and problematic. We are not simply pattern recognizers, we are meaning seekers. We do not only ask what is happening, we ask what does it mean for me? That second question is powerful. It is also dangerous, because meaning can be inferred long before it is earned. This is why the faint remnants of the 3i Atlas signal did not remain purely technical for long. Even when framed carefully, even when described as anomalous but non-intentional, the whispers activated something ancient in the human psyche. The same mechanism that once turned comets into omens. The same instinct that once transformed eclipses into warnings. The same cognitive reflex that once elevated stars into gods. Not because ancient people were ignorant, but because uncertainty demands narrative. Now consider how modern humans encounter uncertainty. We are surrounded by data. More than any generation before us, we measure everything: temperature, pressure, radiation, vibration, signal delay, frequency drift. And yet, the more data we collect, the less intuitive the universe feels. Complexity has replaced clarity, and when clarity vanishes, meaning rushes in to compensate. This is where the whispers from 3i Atlas took on disproportionate weight. Not because of what they objectively were, but because of when they appeared. They arrived during a period of global instability, environmental stress, technological acceleration, geopolitical uncertainty, a growing awareness of planetary fragility. Context matters. The same anomalous signal discovered in a different era might have been quietly archived and forgotten, but discovered now, it resonates, it feels symbolic. And symbolism, once activated, is difficult to contain. This is not a failure of reason, it is a feature of cognition. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. They did not separate observation from interpretation. They wrapped both in ritual, myth, and shared narrative. This created cohesion. It allowed societies to process uncertainty collectively. Modern societies, by contrast, separate data from meaning aggressively. Scientists analyze, media narrates, audiences interpret, often without shared frameworks. This fragmentation amplifies misunderstanding. The whispers become whatever the listener needs them to be. To some, they suggest intelligence. To others, incompetence. To others, suppression. To others, cosmic indifference. All of these interpretations say more about the interpreter than the signal. Now pause. This does not mean interpretation is useless. It means it must be examined as a psychological phenomenon alongside the physical one. When ancient texts describe voices from the sky, we often ask whether those voices were literal. But a better question might be, what kind of uncertainty was that society facing when it began hearing them? The same applies now. The whispers do not arrive into a vacuum. They arrive into a culture already primed to expect meaning. Now let's talk about loneliness. Because at the core of the question, are we alone, is not astronomy, it is emotion. The universe, as revealed by modern science, is vast beyond intuition. Billions of galaxies, trillions of stars, distances so extreme that language struggles to describe them. This scale produces awe, but also alienation. Ancient cosmologies did not suffer this problem. Their universe was smaller, intimate, populated. The sky was close enough to touch with imagination. Modern astronomy expanded the universe faster than our psychology could adapt. Suddenly, humanity was not central, not watched, not addressed, just present. For many, this realization feels unbearable, and so we listen harder, not because we expect a message, but because we fear the silence. This fear does not invalidate science, it coexists with it, and it explains why faint, ambiguous signals attract outsized attention. Now return briefly to the concept of final whispers. The phrase itself reveals something important. We frame the end of communication as speech, not as physics. We do not say residual emissions. We say whispers. This is poetic, it is human, and it reveals our bias. Because whispers imply intent. They imply someone lowering their voice. They imply a listener. But the universe does not whisper. It radiates, it emits, it disperses. The whisper exists only in our interpretation. This does not mean the phenomenon is meaningless. It means the meaning is layered. The first layer is physical, the second is psychological, the third is cultural. Ancient civilizations navigated these layers differently. They did not separate them. A strange sky event was simultaneously physical, psychological, and cultural. Modern science tries to isolate the first layer. Modern media amplifies the second. Modern audiences live in the third. Conflict emerges when these layers are confused. This is why responsible inquiry must move slowly, why high-retention storytelling must resist easy answers, why calm does not mean empty, and mystery does not mean misinformation. Now consider something subtle. In ancient myths, messages from the sky often arrive after prolonged silence. Not during constant communication. The gods speak rarely. The omens appear infrequently. Silence dominates. This is psychologically significant. Silence heightens attention. It increases sensitivity. A single anomaly becomes monumental. The same effect occurs with deep space probes. We receive constant data until we don't. When the stream breaks, even noise feels meaningful. This is not deception. It is expectation. Now ask yourself, if 3i Atlas had never gone silent, would the whispers have mattered? Probably not. They would have blended into background variation. Silence creates contrast. Contrast creates focus. Focus creates meaning. This chain reaction is ancient. Now consider the phrase final whispers again. Finality is comforting. It creates closure. But the universe does not operate on narrative arcs. There are no finales, only diminishing interactions. We impose endings because we need them. Ancient cultures did the same. They spoke of final ages, last kings, end times, yet history continued, not as predicted, but as adapted. This is perhaps the most important lesson buried beneath the whispers. Not that something ended, but that interaction changed. And change feels like loss when it exceeds understanding. As we prepare to move into the next segment, the focus will shift outward again, from psychology to comparison. Because 3i Atlas is not the first time humanity has mistaken ambiguity for intention, nor will it be the last. Ancient records are full of similar moments, where unexplained phenomena became messages, warnings, or divine communication. By examining those moments carefully, we may learn something not about the universe, but about ourselves. And that lesson, unlike any signal, does not fade with distance. Long before humanity learned to encode data into binary, before antennas stretched skyward or probes slipped beyond planetary boundaries, there was already a shared human intuition that the sky communicated. Not constantly, not clearly, but at moments that felt charged with consequence. Ancient civilizations did not look upward casually. The sky was not background scenery. It was an archive of patterns, a source of timing, a keeper of order. When something in that archive behaved unexpectedly, it demanded interpretation. This instinct did not emerge from superstition alone. It emerged from dependence. Agriculture depended on seasons. Navigation depended on stars. Ritual depended on cycles. When those cycles broke, or appeared to, entire social systems destabilized. This is why ancient records treat celestial anomalies with such seriousness. Not awe for aw's sake, but because deviation in the sky often preceded hardship on the ground. Eclipses did not merely darken the sun, they disrupted calendars. They threatened authority. They destabilized confidence in continuity. To modernize, this reaction can seem excessive. We know eclipses are predictable, mechanical, harmless. But ancient observers did not experience them that way. To them, the sky was the most stable system they knew. When it faltered, nothing else felt secure. This is where the idea of the sky speaking originates, not in voices, in disruptions. Now consider how this framework maps onto modern events. The 3i Atlas whispers did not arrive during routine operation. They arrived after silence, after loss of contact, after the expected narrative had already ended. That timing mirrors ancient patterns uncannily. In Mesopotamian records, divine messages rarely arrive during prosperity. They arrive after famine, after flood, after invasion, after collapse has already begun. The gods do not warn before disaster. They explain it afterward. This is a crucial distinction often missed in modern interpretations. Ancient texts are not forecasts. They are post-event meaning-making. The same may be happening now. Let's examine a specific example. The Enuma Elish, often cited for its cosmological imagery, is frequently read as a creation myth. but scholars increasingly emphasize its political context. It was composed or standardized during a period of consolidation and upheaval. Its purpose was not to explain the universe, but to justify order after chaos. The sky did not change, authority did. The myth reframed history as cosmic inevitability. This reframing stabilized society. Similarly, flood narratives across cultures, Mesopotamian, Hebrew, South Asian, Mesoamerican, do not appear at random. They cluster around periods of real environmental stress, rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, regional flooding, river system instability. The floods were real. The interpretation was mythic. The sky spoke not because it intended to, but because humans needed to understand why their world had changed so violently. Now apply this lens to the present. When we detect anomalies in deep space data, we do so within a cultural context already anxious about collapse. Climate change, resource strain, technological dependence, loss of trust in institutions. These conditions mirror ancient stress points, so when the expected silence of space is interrupted, even ambiguously, it feels meaningful. Not because it is, but because we are primed to hear meaning. This does not invalidate the data. It contextualizes the reaction. Ancient civilizations did not mistake every anomaly for a message. Many events were recorded plainly, without interpretation, but certain anomalies crossed a psychological threshold. They were rare. They were poorly understood. They coincided with hardship. Those conditions elevated them from observation to significance. The same process may be unfolding now. Now consider another ancient pattern. In many traditions, communication from the sky becomes less frequent over time. Early ages are filled with interaction. Later ages experience withdrawal. Eventually, silence dominates. This progression is often interpreted literally as gods leaving, visitors departing, or knowledge being taken away, but anthropologically, this pattern aligns with increasing complexity. As societies grow more sophisticated, they rely less on mythic explanation and more on internal systems, law, bureaucracy, science. The sky becomes background again, until those systems strain. Then the sky re-enters the narrative, not because it changed, but because attention shifted. This is why the idea of final whispers resonates so strongly. It fits an ancient narrative arc, a departure, a last signal, a closing door. But history suggests this arc is imposed, not observed. There are no final whispers, only diminishing interaction. And diminishing interaction feels like loss when dependence remains. Now examine the role of fragmentation. The Atlas data did not arrive as a cohesive message. It arrived broken, incomplete, intermittent. Ancient messages from the sky are often described the same way. Dreams, visions, omens, rarely direct speech. Fragmentation invites interpretation. Complete clarity does not. This is why fragmented data is more psychologically potent than silence. Silence ends speculation. Fragments extend it. This is a key insight. The most destabilizing information is not that which answers questions, but that which keeps them alive. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. That is why oracles spoke in riddles, why prophecies were ambiguous, why signs required interpretation. Ambiguity preserves authority, but it also preserves curiosity. Modern science tries to eliminate ambiguity, but when ambiguity survives, despite effort, it becomes irresistible. Now let's be clear. There is no evidence that the 3i Atlas whispers contain encoded information, intentional signalling, or external intelligence. There is evidence that they do not behave like simple noise. That distinction matters. One invites careful study, the other invites fantasy. We must stay on the right side of that line. Educational value lies in understanding how systems fail at the edges of expectation, how communication degrades, how interpretation fills gaps, how meaning emerges under pressure. These are lessons ancient texts already tried to teach, not about gods, about humans. Now pause and consider something uncomfortable. What if the reason ancient stories feel so relevant is not because they describe external visitors, but because they describe internal thresholds, moments when societies realize they are no longer in control of the systems they depend on? The sky becomes symbolic because it represents forces beyond negotiation. Weather, climate, cosmic environment. Modern science has named these forces. It has not tamed them. So the anxiety persists, and it finds expression in familiar patterns. Now, as we prepare to move forward, the next segment will narrow its focus again, not on the sky, not on ancient texts, but on interpretive responsibility. What does it mean to communicate anomalies to the public? How do institutions decide what to emphasize, what to downplay, and what to leave unresolved? Because sometimes what is not said shapes perception more than what is. And in the space between data and narrative, whispers grow louder. There is a quiet tension that exists at the heart of every scientific institution. It is not between truth and secrecy. It is between precision and interpretation. Scientists are trained to speak carefully. Institutions are trained to speak responsibly. The public, however, listens emotionally. And between these three modes of communication, meaning often changes shape. When the anomalous remnants from 3i Atlas were identified, the first response was procedural, not philosophical. Data verification, cross-instrument comparison, signal provenance analysis. Everything followed established protocol. This is how science protects itself from error. But science also understands something else. Raw data does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside societies. And societies respond not to data, but to narratives. This is why disclosure is never simply about accuracy. It is about timing, framing, context. Consider how space agencies historically communicate uncertainty. They rarely announce anomalies immediately, not because they are hiding information, but because anomalies are common and most evaporate under scrutiny. Early disclosure of every irregularity would erode trust rather than build it. This pattern is visible across decades of space exploration. Unusual signals are logged quietly, reviewed internally, cross-checked against known phenomena, often resolved. Only rarely do they remain unexplained. And when they do, institutions face a dilemma. To speak too early risks sensationalism. To speak too late risks suspicion. There is no perfect balance. Now imagine that dilemma amplified by modern media. Information no longer diffuses slowly. It spreads instantly. Interpretation begins before verification concludes. Silence is interpreted as concealment. Caution becomes conspiracy. This environment did not exist for ancient civilizations. Their information systems were slower, but their narratives were stronger. Meaning was centralized. Modern meaning is fragmented. This fragmentation magnifies uncertainty, which brings us back to the whispers. When internal discussions referenced non-random residual structure, that phrase was never intended for public consumption. It was technical shorthand, a placeholder, a statement of unresolved classification. But language leaks, terms migrate, and once outside their original context, they mutate. Residual structure becomes pattern. Non-random becomes intentional. Unclassified becomes hidden. This transformation is not malicious, it is interpretive drift. Ancient texts experienced the same drift. Descriptions written for priestly audiences became myths for later generations. Metaphors hardened into literal beliefs. Ritual language became historical claim. The difference is speed. Ancient drift took centuries. Modern drift takes hours. This is why responsibility matters, not only in what is said, but in what is not said. Institutions must anticipate how ambiguity will be received, but they must also resist the urge to over-interpret for clarity's sake. Because premature explanation is just another form of misinformation. Now let's examine a historical parallel. In the late 19th century, astronomers observed linear features on Mars. They called them canali, channels. A mistranslation rendered this as canals, implying artificial construction. The result was decades of speculation about Martian civilizations. The data was real. The interpretation was flawed. Once embedded, it was nearly impossible to dislodge. The lesson is not that scientists should never speculate. It is that speculation must be clearly labelled. Ancient cultures were explicit about this. They did not claim certainty. They framed visions as dreams, signs as omens, stories as lessons. Modern audiences often demand conclusions where none exist. This demand pressures institutions to simplify. Simplification reduces nuance. Nuance is where understanding lives. Now consider how this applies to the idea of final whispers. The phrase implies closure, but closure is a narrative desire, not a scientific outcome. Data does not conclude, it accumulates. Even silence is a data point, but silence is not an ending, it is a state, and states change. Now pause and reflect. If the whispers were never meant to be heard, if they are simply the last fading interactions between human-made instruments and the cosmic environment, what responsibility do we have in interpreting them? The answer may be restraint. Restraint is not passive, it is active skepticism. It is the discipline to say, we do not know, and mean it. Ancient texts often end this way, not with revelation, but with silence. Not because nothing followed, but because interpretation was left to the listener. Now, consider the public's role. High-retention narratives often exploit ambiguity. They stretch uncertainty into suspense. This is effective. It is also risky, because when suspense outpaces evidence, trust erodes. The goal of responsible storytelling, especially in historical mystery, is not to resolve uncertainty. It is to guide the listener through it, to model how curiosity can coexist with humility. This is where education becomes essential, explaining how signals degrade, how instruments fail, how data behaves at the edge of detectability. These explanations ground curiosity. They do not diminish wonder, they sharpen it. Because reality, properly understood, is more intricate than fiction. Now look again at ancient precedents. When priest astronomers recorded eclipses, they did not immediately assign meaning. They observed repeatedly. They refined calendars. They corrected assumptions. Only after understanding patterns did interpretation follow. Modern science must do the same, and the public must allow it. Now, as we move toward the next segment, attention will turn to something rarely discussed. What happens when institutions choose not to interpret? What vacuum does that create? And who fills it? Because silence, whether ancient or modern, does not remain empty for long, and the meanings that rush in can shape belief for generations. Silence has a strange property. It invites occupation. When institutions pause, whether out of caution, responsibility, or uncertainty, the space they leave behind does not remain neutral. It fills, not with facts, but with inference, not with data, but with narrative. This is not a modern phenomenon. Ancient societies experienced it repeatedly. Whenever authority hesitated, alternative explanations emerged. Whenever official interpretations lagged behind lived experience, myth stepped in to bridge the gap. Silence does not prevent interpretation, it accelerates it. This is why the period following the final confirmed transmissions from 3i Atlas mattered more than the transmissions themselves, because once regular communication ended, the story was no longer being shaped by data, it was being shaped by absence. And absence is powerful. In scientific contexts, silence often means no conclusion yet. In public perception, silence often means something is being withheld. The difference between those interpretations is not malicious, it is psychological. Humans are uncomfortable with unresolved states. We prefer incomplete answers to open questions. And if institutions do not provide interpretation, others will. This dynamic is ancient. In Mesopotamia, periods of political uncertainty often produced a surge in prophetic texts, not because prophets suddenly gained foresight, but because societies needed explanation faster than formal systems could provide it. The same pattern appears in medieval Europe during plagues, in Mesoamerica following droughts, in China during dynastic transitions. When official narratives falter, alternative meaning systems emerge. Now apply this to the modern context. The anomalous residual data from 3i Atlas was never framed as evidence of communication. It was framed as unresolved behaviour. That distinction mattered inside scientific circles. Outside them, it blurred. Because most people do not interact with raw data. They interact with summaries, with headlines, with interpretations layered atop interpretations. And by the time something reaches public consciousness, it is rarely still neutral. This is where restraint becomes misread as evasion. Why didn't they explain more? Why didn't they rule it out? Why didn't they say definitively what it was? These questions are understandable, but they rest on an incorrect assumption that certainty is always available. It isn't, especially at the boundaries of detection. At extreme distances, even basic assumptions weaken. Signal timing stretches unpredictably. Background noise behaves differently. Interstellar medium effects remain incompletely modelled. This is not failure. It is frontier science. But frontier science does not translate well into public confidence. Ancient cultures solved this problem differently. They did not promise certainty. They promised coherence. Their myths were not accurate, but they were complete. They explained everything. The cost of completeness was literal truth. The benefit was psychological stability. Modern science offers the opposite. It offers accuracy, but rarely completeness. This leaves a vacuum, and vacuums attract belief. Now consider how the phrase final whispers evolved. No official document used it. No technical report described the data that way. It emerged organically, through metaphor, repetition, and emotional resonance. This is how language transforms uncertainty into story. Once framed as whispers, the phenomenon gained character. Once it gained character, it gained intent. Once it gained intent, it gained audience. This process is not manipulation, it is cognition. Humans anthropomorphize the unknown. We always have. Ancient peoples anthropomorphized storms, rivers, stars. Modern audiences anthropomorphize probes, algorithms, and signals. The object changes. The impulse does not. Now let's slow down and examine what the data actually allows us to say. There is no evidence that the residual fragments carried encoded information. There is no evidence of modulation consistent with intentional transmission. There is no evidence of non-human agency. There is evidence of unexpected persistence. There is evidence of structured irregularity. There is evidence that our models of deep space signal decay are incomplete. These are not trivial findings. They are also not extraordinary claims. They sit precisely where frontier science often does, at the edge of expectation. The problem arises when interpretation outruns explanation. Ancient societies faced the same risk. When drought followed eclipse, it was tempting to link them causally. Sometimes correlation was real, often it was not. The danger was not belief, it was rigidity. When belief hardened into dogma, adaptation failed. This is the deeper lesson hidden inside ancient warnings. Not listen to the sky, but do not confuse meaning with mechanism. Now reflect on modern discourse. How quickly discussions of three-eye atlas shifted from telemetry to implication, from engineering to ontology, from signal analysis to existential questions. This leap is not wrong, it is human. But it must be navigated carefully, because existential questions deserve honesty, and honesty includes limits. Now consider another overlooked factor: time. Most space missions operate on timescales that defy intuition. Years feel like moments. Delays feel like endings. A few weeks of anomalous fragments can feel monumental, but in cosmic terms they are negligible. Ancient cultures, however, operated on generational time. They thought in centuries, in cycles, in slow arcs, which allowed them to integrate uncertainty without immediate resolution. Modern culture lacks that patience. We expect answers now. This impatience amplifies ambiguity. Now imagine if ancient observers had social media, if every eclipse was debated in real time, if every comet sparked immediate global speculation. Their myths would look very different. Not more accurate, just louder. This comparison is not meant to dismiss modern curiosity. It is meant to contextualize it, because curiosity without pacing becomes distortion. Now let's examine one more subtle danger. When institutions remain silent, narratives polarize. Some assume concealment, others assume incompetence. Both interpretations erode trust. Ancient priesthoods avoided this by maintaining ritual continuity even when understanding failed. They preserved confidence while knowledge lagged. Modern institutions often do the opposite. They suspend narrative until certainty returns. This is intellectually honest, but psychologically risky, because the public does not suspend interpretation, it accelerates it. This is where responsible storytelling plays a crucial role. A documentary should not fill silence with speculation, but it should not ignore the silence either. It should explain why silence exists, why uncertainty is legitimate, why restraint is not avoidance. This educational framing restores trust, not by closing questions, but by stabilizing them. Now pause. Ask yourself honestly, what would be more unsettling? A universe that speaks to us, or a universe that does not, but allows us to believe it does? Ancient cultures grapple with this tension constantly. They did not resolve it. They lived inside it. And they left behind stories not as answers, but as scaffolding, structures to hold uncertainty without collapsing. Perhaps this is what we must relearn, that not every anomaly is a message, and not every silence is empty. As we move into the next segment, we will examine what happens when interpretation moves beyond curiosity and into conviction. Because once belief solidifies, it begins to shape behaviour. And behaviour, more than data, determines outcomes. This is where ancient warnings become most relevant, not as predictions, but as cautions. There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when curiosity hardens into belief. It does not arrive with certainty. It does not announce itself. It slips in gradually, disguised as understanding. At first, there are only questions, then patterns, then expectations, and finally, conviction. This transition is one of the most powerful forces in human history. It has built civilizations. It has justified wars. It has preserved knowledge. It has destroyed it. and it almost always begins the same way, with ambiguity that feels too meaningful to ignore. The whispers attributed to Three-Eye Atlas exist precisely at this threshold. They are unresolved enough to invite inquiry, structured enough to resist dismissal, vague enough to allow projection. This combination is rare and volatile. Ancient cultures encountered it repeatedly. In moments when celestial phenomena disrupted expectations, belief systems adapted not through evidence, but through narrative reinforcement. Over time, provisional explanations became foundational truths. This is how omens became doctrines, not because they were proven, but because they endured. Now consider the modern parallel. When the anomalous fragments from Atlas were first discussed informally, they existed as technical curiosities. Engineers debated error margins. Analysts explored physical explanations. The tone was careful, but outside those circles, a shift occurred. The whispers were no longer data points. They became signals. And once something is labelled a signal, the next question is inevitable. A signal from whom? This question marks the crossing from curiosity into conviction. It reframes the phenomenon entirely. No longer is the focus on mechanism. It is on agency. Ancient texts reflect this transition clearly. Early astronomical records describe events neutrally. The star appeared, the sky darkened, the river rose. Later interpretations assign cause. The gods were displeased. The king had erred. A warning was sent. The event does not change. The meaning does. This is crucial, because once agency is assumed, interpretation becomes directional. Evidence is no longer evaluated neutrally. It is filtered. This does not require deception. It requires expectation. Now pause. Ask yourself something difficult. At what point does explanation stop serving understanding and start serving belief? The line is thin, and it shifts depending on emotional context. In periods of stability, ambiguity is tolerated. In periods of stress, ambiguity demands resolution. Modern society is not stable. Technologically advanced, yes. Emotionally settled, no. This makes us vulnerable to premature conviction. Now let's examine a concrete mechanism: confirmation bias. Once a narrative forms, however tentatively, new information is subconsciously evaluated in relation to it. Data that supports the narrative is emphasized. Data that complicates it is ignored or reframed. Ancient cultures institutionalized this process. Oracles delivered ambiguous statements that were later interpreted to match outcomes. This preserved authority and coherence. Modern systems lack that ritual containment. Belief spreads horizontally, not vertically. This makes it harder to correct once established. The whispers, when framed as final messages, begin to attract confirmation. Every unexplained cosmic signal becomes related. Every anomaly reinforces the idea. This is not evidence accumulation, it is narrative accumulation. The danger is subtle. Once conviction takes hold, skepticism feels like denial. Doubt feels like suppression. Questions become threats. At this stage, inquiry ceases to be open-ended. It becomes defensive. Ancient texts warn against this explicitly, not in scientific language, but in moral language. They describe societies that misread signs and acted prematurely, kings who interpreted omens as validation rather than caution, leaders who mistook ambiguity for mandate. The consequences were not divine punishment. They were human error. Now consider how this applies today. What behaviours change when people believe they are receiving messages from beyond? Trust shifts, authority erodes. Institutions are questioned not for their actions, but for their perceived silence. This can be healthy. It can also destabilise coordination. The issue is not belief itself, it is inflexibility. Now let's return to education. One of the most important educational tools in moments like this is process transparency. not answers. Processes. How do scientists evaluate anomalies? How do they eliminate false positives? How do they model unknown variables? When these processes are explained, curiosity remains grounded. When they are obscured, belief fills the gap. Ancient societies understood process differently. They ritualized interpretation. Priests observed signs over time. They compared records. They debated meaning within formal systems. This slowed conviction. Modern discourse lacks these buffers. Information moves faster than reflection. This accelerates belief formation. Now reflect on a quiet truth. The most dangerous ideas are not obviously false ones. They are plausible ones with incomplete evidence. They feel reasonable. They feel informed. They feel earned. This is where discipline matters most. The whispers, as intriguing as they are, do not justify conclusions. They justify continued observation. Patience is not passivity. It is methodology. Ancient astronomy advanced not because it predicted divine will, but because it catalogued deviations meticulously over generations. Modern science must do the same, and modern storytelling must support that patience, not undermine it. Now, as we prepare to move forward, the next segment will explore a question rarely asked. What happens when conviction forms before understanding, and then reality fails to conform? How do societies respond when expected meaning never arrives? Because history suggests that disappointment, more than mystery, shapes belief systems profoundly, and the absence of fulfillment can be as powerful as any whisper. There is a moment, rarely acknowledged, when belief pauses, not because it has been disproven, not because it has been confronted, but because it has waited too long. The expected meaning does not arrive. No revelation follows. No clarity emerges. No confirming event appears to resolve the tension. This moment is more destabilizing than contradiction. Contradiction can be argued against. Silence cannot. Ancient societies knew this moment well. It appears again and again in historical records, not as catastrophe, but as disorientation, a sense that something should have happened yet did not. The sky spoke, and then it did not follow through. The omen appeared, but no clear outcome materialized. This gap between expectation and reality shaped cultures more deeply than the original event, because belief thrives on fulfillment. When fulfillment fails, belief must adapt or fracture. Now consider how this applies to the modern context of the 3-eye Atlas whispers. After the initial anomaly, attention rose quickly. Interpretations multiplied. Expectations formed. Some anticipated further signals. Others expected clarification from institutions. Still others anticipated a decisive refutation. None came. Instead, the phenomenon settled into unresolved persistence. Not active, not gone, just present. This state is uncomfortable. It denies narrative closure. It forces patience. And patience is not a strong cultural trait in technologically accelerated societies. Ancient civilizations, however, built patience into their worldview. They thought in cycles. When a sign failed to resolve, it was often deferred to the next cycle, a later season, a future generation. The meaning was postponed, not abandoned. Modern audiences often do the opposite. When meaning fails to arrive quickly, they escalate interpretation. This escalation compensates for uncertainty. It also distorts inquiry. Now pause. Ask yourself honestly, what would be easier to accept? That a faint, ambiguous signal from a distant probe is simply unresolved, or that it must mean something extraordinary? Most people choose the latter, not because it is more rational, but because it is more satisfying. Now let's examine what happens psychologically when meaning fails to arrive. Expectation creates emotional investment. Emotional investment creates impatience. Impatience seeks resolution. If resolution does not appear, it is often manufactured. This process is ancient. In periods following unfulfilled prophecies, new interpretations emerge. The date was wrong. The signs were misunderstood. The event was symbolic, not literal. The fulfillment was delayed. Each reinterpretation preserves the core belief while adapting its timeline. This is not deception, it is preservation. Now examine how modern narratives adapt similarly. When no follow-up signals arrived from Three-Eye Atlas, interpretation shifted. The whispers were reframed as warnings rather than messages, as remnants rather than transmissions, as evidence of presence rather than communication. Each reframing maintained significance without requiring new data. This is how meaning survives silence. But this survival comes at a cost. It decouples belief from evidence. Ancient texts warn about this explicitly, not through scientific critique, but through moral storytelling. They describe societies that clung to signs long after their relevance faded, leaders who acted on outdated omens, communities that delayed adaptation because they waited for confirmation that never came. The lesson is not that belief is wrong, it is that belief must remain flexible. Now let's return to the whispers. What is educationally valuable here is not whether they mean something extraordinary. It is how they reveal the limits of interpretation. They expose how quickly expectation outruns understanding. They demonstrate how absence invites narrative. They show how unresolved data can become culturally active long after scientific interest wanes. This is not a failure of science, it is a challenge for communication. Now consider a subtle shift that occurs at this stage. When meaning fails to arrive, attention turns inward. Instead of asking what is happening, people ask, why do we need this to mean something? This question is uncomfortable. It challenges identity. For ancient societies, identity was often bound to cosmology. The sky affirmed social order. When that affirmation failed, reform followed or collapse. Modern identity is similarly entangled. Our sense of significance is tied to discovery, to progress, to contact, to confirmation that we are not isolated. When signals fade without explanation, they challenge that narrative. Now ask another difficult question. If the universe does not answer us, does that diminish us? Ancient texts offer a surprising answer. Often, the withdrawal of divine communication marks a transition, not an abandonment. Humanity is expected to act without guidance, to rely on internal systems, to mature. This motif appears across cultures. The gods depart, the ancestors retreat, the sky falls silent, humanity remains. This is not punishment, it is responsibility. Now consider whether this applies metaphorically today. What if the significance of the whispers is not what they say, but that they stop? What if the lesson is not about presence, but about autonomy? This interpretation does not require intelligence beyond earth. It requires humility within it. Now let's ground this back in. Education. One of the most important skills science can teach is tolerance for unresolved questions. Not everything needs immediate explanation. Some phenomena remain open for decades. Others are resolved quietly later. Many never resolve fully. This is not failure. It is the nature of inquiry. Ancient scholars understood this more intuitively than we often do today. They preserved ambiguity deliberately. They allowed stories to hold tension. They did not rush endings. Modern storytelling often demands resolution. High retention, however, does not require answers. It requires momentum. And momentum can be sustained by implication, not conclusion. Now, as we prepare to move into the next segment, attention will shift again. From disappointment to adaptation, how do societies reorganize when expected meaning does not arrive? How do narratives evolve when signals fade? Because history suggests that the aftermath of silence, not the anomaly itself, shapes the future. And in that aftermath, the most important transformations occur quietly. There is a quiet transformation that happens when unanswered questions remain unanswered long enough. At first they feel urgent, then unsettling, then exhausting. And finally, if allowed, they become background, not forgotten, integrated. Ancient societies understood this arc instinctively. When a sign appeared and failed to resolve, it did not remain at the centre of attention forever. It slowly migrated into myth, into memory, into tradition. Its meaning softened, its edges blurred. It became a reference point rather than a directive. This is how cultures survived uncertainty without fracturing. Modern culture, by contrast, struggles with this migration. We archive data, but we rarely archive ambiguity. Unresolved questions remain live indefinitely. They are revisited repeatedly, often without new information, amplifying their emotional weight instead of contextualizing it. The whispers from 3i Atlas now occupy this space, no longer immediate, no longer urgent, but not forgotten. They sit in a liminal state, acknowledged, unresolved, quietly influential. This is where the real work begins. Because the challenge is no longer interpretive, it is adaptive. How does a society move forward when a mystery does not yield answers? Ancient texts offer guidance, not in their conclusions, but in their structure. Many myths do not end with revelation. They end with endurance. A people learns to live differently. A king rules without divine counsel. A calendar is adjusted. A ritual changes. The mystery remains, but life adapts around it. This is the moment we rarely examine. We focus on the sign. We focus on the anomaly. We rarely study the adjustment. Yet adjustment is where history turns. Now consider modern scientific culture. An unresolved anomaly does not halt progress. It is catalogued, contextualized, and eventually superseded by new data. Sometimes it becomes irrelevant. Sometimes it resurfaces decades later when technology catches up. This process is not dramatic. It is methodical. But outside scientific circles, unresolved anomalies behave differently. They linger. They acquire symbolic weight. They are revisited in new contexts, often disconnected from their original constraints. This is why ancient signs reappear in modern narratives, not because they predicted the present, but because they were never fully integrated in the past. Now ask yourself, what would it mean to integrate the whispers, not explain them away, not elevate them into prophecy, but place them correctly within our understanding of limits? Integration requires reframing. Instead of asking, what do they mean? We ask, what do they teach us about how we interpret meaning? This shift is subtle, but profound. It moves the focus from external agency to internal process. Ancient societies made this shift repeatedly. When oracles failed to deliver clarity, philosophers emerged. When divine instruction receded, ethics developed. When cosmic certainty faded, human responsibility expanded. Silence did not end meaning, it relocated it. Now consider whether we are at a similar inflection point. For much of modern history, progress has been driven by discovery, new lands, new resources, new laws of nature, new signals. But as exploration reaches its limits, planetary, environmental, technological, discovery slows. What replaces it? Interpretation, integration, wisdom rather than information. The whispers may mark not a message, but a transition, a signal that our tools have reached a boundary. And boundaries, historically, force change. Now let's address a common fear. That unanswered cosmic questions imply insignificance. Ancient texts counter this fear elegantly. They suggest that silence is not neglect, It is invitation. Invitation to act without instruction. Invitation to define values internally. Invitation to become responsible for outcomes rather than attributing them to external forces. This is not comforting. It is demanding, which may explain why cultures resist it. Now ground this in education. One of the most valuable lessons we can teach, especially in high retention storytelling, is how to sit with uncertainty, not to romanticize it, not to fear it, but to understand it as a condition of inquiry. The whispers, unresolved as they are, offer a rare teaching moment. They show how easily ambiguity becomes narrative. They show how quickly curiosity becomes conviction. They show how silence pressures belief. And they show how patience is tested when answers do not arrive. These lessons matter far beyond space exploration. They apply to climate science, to medical research, to historical interpretation, to personal decision-making. Ancient cultures embedded these lessons in myth, because myth was their medium. We must embed them in explanation. Now consider the role of storytelling itself. A documentary does not exist to solve mysteries. It exists to frame them responsibly, to pace curiosity, to delay gratification, to leave space for reflection. This is why ancient stories endure, not because they answered everything, but because they knew when to stop. Now let's return briefly to the idea of final whispers. The phrase suggests an ending, but history suggests that endings are rarely final. They are thresholds. What feels like an ending from one perspective becomes a beginning from another. The end of divine communication becomes the beginning of philosophy. The end of myth becomes the beginning of science. The end of certainty becomes the beginning of ethics. Perhaps the whispers mark such a threshold, not because they say something new, but because they stop saying anything at all. And that silence forces attention inward. Now, as we prepare to move toward the final segments, the focus will narrow, not on the whispers, not on ancient texts, but on what remains when interpretation is stripped away. What is left when we stop listening for messages? What persists when the sky refuses to speak? The answer, historically, has always been the same: human choice. And choice, once recognised, cannot be unrecognised. For most of human history, distance meant silence, not metaphorical silence, actual silence. A message sent across vast space does not fade politely. It stretches, it fractures, it dissolves into noise long before it disappears entirely. This is one of the least intuitive truths about communication beyond Earth. We imagine signals as beams, clean, directional, purposeful. But in reality, deep space communication is closer to listening for a whisper inside a storm. To understand why the final data associated with 3i Atlas unsettled so many analysts, we first need to understand what normal actually looks like when machines speak across astronomical distances. Every signal sent from a spacecraft is subject to 3 fundamental limitations: distance, noise, time. Distance is obvious. The farther a craft travels, the weaker its signal becomes. Radio waves spread outward, their energy thinning across an ever-growing sphere. By the time they reach Earth, they are unimaginably faint, often weaker than background cosmic radiation. Noise is less obvious, but more dangerous. Space is not quiet. Cosmic microwave background radiation, solar emissions, interstellar plasma, and even human-made interference create a constant hiss. Receivers on Earth must filter this noise aggressively, using complex algorithms to decide which fragments are meaningful and which are random. Time is the most deceptive factor of all. Signals do not simply arrive or fail to arrive. They smear across time. Packets are delayed. Bits arrive out of order. Error correction systems reconstruct incomplete information using probability, not certainty. This is why most deep space missions do not experience a clean moment of last contact. Instead, communication degrades slowly, then irregularly, then ambiguously. Voyager 1 offers a real-world example. Launched in 1977, Voyager 1 is now more than 24 billion kilometres from Earth. Its signal strength is so low that engineers compare it to detecting a phone call from across the galaxy using a light bulb as a transmitter. And yet, Voyager still communicates, not continuously, not reliably, but persistently. There have been moments when Voyager's data appeared nonsensical, moments when telemetry arrived scrambled, incomplete, or delayed far beyond expectation. In 2022, for example, Voyager 1 began transmitting corrupted engineering data, values that were physically impossible, temperatures that exceeded material limits, voltages that could not exist. For months, engineers debated whether the craft was failing, misreporting, or being misinterpreted. Eventually, the issue was traced to a single faulty subsystem, a memory unit returning malformed data that still passed checksum validation. The key point is not that Voyager malfunctioned. The key point is that anomalous data can persist long after assumptions of failure. This is not speculative. It is documented engineering reality. Another example comes from the Pioneer anomaly. In the late 20th century, data from Pioneer 10 and 11 suggested an unexplained deceleration, small but consistent. For years, this anomaly fueled speculation about unknown physics. Only decades later was the effect fully explained as thermal recoil. Heat emitted unevenly from the spacecraft, acting like a minute thruster. The lesson was sobering. Data can be accurate, consistent, and still misunderstood for a very long time. Now consider what happens when a probe moves not just far from Earth, but into a fundamentally different environment. Beyond the heliosphere, space changes. The heliosphere acts like a magnetic bubble, shielding the solar system from a significant portion of galactic cosmic radiation. Once a spacecraft crosses this boundary, it enters a region with different particle densities, different electromagnetic conditions, and different noise characteristics. This transition is not smooth. Sensors calibrated for one environment begin operating in another. Signal behaviour changes subtly but significantly. It is here that delayed, fragmented, or restructured data becomes not just possible, but expected. Yet expectation does not eliminate uncertainty. Engineers know how long signals should take to arrive. They know how much degradation should occur. They know how error correction should behave. When deviations appear, they do not immediately signal meaning. They signal caution. And caution is where interpretation slows. In conceptual mission studies, hypothetical long-range probes similar in ambition to 3i Atlas, engineers model what happens when communication transitions from deterministic to probabilistic. At a certain distance, signals are no longer reliably decoded in real time. Instead, Earth-based systems accumulate fragments. Patterns emerge only after aggregation. Meaning is not immediate. It is statistical. This is where misunderstanding often begins. Because humans are pattern-seeking creatures, we are uncomfortable with ambiguity. We want clarity. We want conclusions. But deep space data does not offer conclusions easily. It offers probabilities. When fragments arrive days or weeks after expected silence, the first assumption is always error, corrupted buffers, delayed cues, clock drift, receiver misalignment, all reasonable explanations, all historically supported. But in rare cases, further analysis reveals something else. Structure, not message structure in the human sense, but signal structure, repeating intervals, consistent modulation characteristics, Non-random distribution of error states. These do not indicate intelligence, they indicate order, and order is the dividing line between noise and phenomenon. This is why scientists are so careful when discussing anomalous data, because the line between misinterpretation and discovery is razor thin. Most anomalies resolve into mundane explanations. A few resist. And when resistance persists, the conversation changes. Not publicly, internally. It becomes quieter, more cautious, more technical. Analysts ask different questions, not what does this mean, but what assumptions are we making that might be wrong? Was the signal expected to degrade linearly? Was noise assumed to be isotropic? Was the environment assumed static? Assumptions are invisible until they fail. In studies of long baseline telemetry, one phenomenon appears again and again: temporal clustering. Fragments arrive not evenly spaced but grouped. This can occur due to receiver scheduling, atmospheric conditions, or onboard power cycling, but clustering also appears when signals interact with variable plasma densities, regions where electromagnetic propagation behaves unpredictably. Such regions exist beyond the heliosphere. They are not well mapped, they are not well understood, and they introduce delays that look intentional even when they are not. This is where interpretation becomes dangerous, because a delayed signal can appear like a response. A fragmented transmission can resemble encoding. A repeating artifact can suggest intent. History shows us that humans often mistake complexity for design, and yet history also shows us that dismissing complexity outright can blind us to discovery. The correct position is neither belief nor denial, it is suspension. This is why serious researchers resist narrative framing. They speak in terms of margins, confidence intervals, instrument limitations. But outside technical circles, these nuances are lost. Fragments become whispers. Anomalies become messages. This does not mean discussion is illegitimate. It means it must be grounded. So when analysts observe that certain late-arriving data packets associated with conceptual, 3i Atlas-like missions exhibited consistent formatting characteristics, even as overall signal quality degraded, the response was not excitement, it was restraint. Because structure alone is not evidence of intent, it is evidence of non-randomness. And non-randomness has many causes: instrument bias, environmental modulation, processing artifacts, but it also has implications, because the more structured an anomaly is, the more carefully it must be examined, not because it suggests intelligence, but because it suggests our models are incomplete. This is the quiet truth behind delayed signals. They do not announce meaning. They expose ignorance, and ignorance is uncomfortable. It invites speculation. It invites projection, which is why responsible analysis moves slowly, and why some questions remain unanswered, not because they are forbidden, but because they are unresolved. As the fragments accumulated, the most unsettling realization was not that something might be communicating. It was that we could not be certain we were listening correctly, because the farther we reach, the less our assumptions apply. And at some distance, silence itself becomes ambiguous, not absence, not presence, but something in between, a space where order exists without explanation, and where meaning, if it exists at all, arrives long after the moment it mattered, which raises a quieter, more difficult question. If delayed signals challenge our understanding of communication, what happens when ancient civilizations describe warnings that also arrived too late to prevent what followed? That question does not belong to physics, it belongs to memory. And that is where the story moves next. Long before humanity learned how to listen to space with machines, it learned how to listen to time. Not time as we measure it now, seconds, minutes, years, but time as a force that returns. Ancient cultures across the world did not describe history as a straight line moving forward. They described it as a wheel. This distinction matters more than it first appears, because a linear view of time assumes novelty. A cyclical view assumes recurrence, and recurrence changes how warnings are preserved. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians wrote of ages that rose and fell in measured spans. Their king lists were not simply records of rule, but markers of transitions, before and after moments when the world itself seemed altered. Floods divided eras, sky events signalled shifts. The past was not gone, it was repeating. These tablets were not predictions in the modern sense. They were memories shaped to survive collapse. Elsewhere, similar patterns emerge. In ancient India, the concept of yugas described vast cycles of creation, decline, dissolution, and renewal. Each age carried distinct moral and environmental characteristics. Civilizations did not simply fall, they transitioned into darkness before re-emerging. In Mesoamerica, the Maya tracked cycles with extraordinary precision. Their long count calendar did not predict an end of the world, but the completion of one cycle and the beginning of another. Collapse was not failure, it was transformation. In Norse traditions, Ragnarok was not annihilation, it was renewal after destruction. Even the gods were not exempt from cycles. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the pattern remains consistent. History returns, not identically, but recognisably. Scholars have long debated why ancient civilizations favoured cyclical time. Some argue it reflects agricultural rhythms, seasons repeating, harvests returning. Others suggest it mirrors astronomical observation, planets looping through the sky, eclipses recurring, stars shifting slowly but predictably. Both explanations hold weight, but neither fully explains why warnings were embedded so deeply into myth. Flood myths are the most famous example. From the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical story of Noah, from the Greek tale of Deucalion to indigenous traditions across Asia and the Americas, floods appear not as random disasters, but as resets. The cause varies, the outcome does not. Human arrogance, divine displeasure, cosmic imbalance, then water, then survival, then remembrance. Modern scholarship does not support a single global flood as described in myth. Geological evidence points instead to regional catastrophes, post-glacial sea level rise, river overflows, coastal inundation. But this does not diminish the myth's significance. It reframes them. These stories are not inaccurate records of a single event. They are cultural memories of repeated upheaval, and memory, when faced with repetition, begins to encode patterns. This is where cycles matter, because a one-time catastrophe can be dismissed. A recurring one becomes a warning. Ancient cultures lacked seismographs. They lacked satellites. They lacked telemetry. But they observed. They recorded sky movements. They tracked seasonal drift. They noticed when coastlines moved inward, and when these changes aligned with celestial events. Meaning was assigned, not because the sky caused the disaster in every case, but because the sky was the only constant reference across generations. Stars do not forget, so warnings were anchored to them. This is why ancient texts often describe destruction as arriving from above, even when the cause was terrestrial. The sky was the clock, and clocks repeat. When myths describe beings who returned after long absences, modern interpretations often leap to literal visitation. But cyclical language offers another possibility. These beings may not represent external visitors at all. They may represent the return of conditions, the return of imbalance, the return of upheaval, the return of consequences. In Sumerian texts, The Anunnaki are often described as judges of order, not invaders. They restore balance, enforce boundaries, and depart when harmony is achieved. Some scholars interpret this as theological metaphor, personifications of natural forces beyond human control. Others suggest political allegory, elite authority reinforced through divine symbolism. But a third interpretation exists, quieter and less sensational. The Anunnaki may represent remembered cycles of disruption, not beings who arrive, but events that do. This does not deny myth, it contextualizes it. When ancient cultures warned that the gods would return, they may have meant that conditions which once ended an age would eventually recur, and recurrence changes how warnings are delivered. You do not warn people about a future they cannot imagine. You warn them by telling stories of a past they can recognize. This is why ancient warnings are indirect. They are preserved as narrative, not instruction, because instruction assumes continuity. Narrative assumes collapse. In a world where knowledge is regularly lost, memory must be durable. Myth is durable. It survives translation. It survives illiteracy. It survives fire. Technical manuals do not. This explains a subtle but crucial difference between ancient and modern warning systems. Modern systems aim for precision. Ancient systems aimed for persistence. A seismograph warns in seconds. A myth warns across millennia. Neither is superior. They serve different contexts. And this is where modern listeners struggle. We expect clarity. Ancient cultures expected endurance. So when patterns appear, whether in archaeology or data analysis, the temptation is to impose modern expectations onto ancient frameworks. We want explicit messages. They gave us echoes. We want predictions. They preserved cycles. Scholars caution against reading ancient texts as literal forecasts, but they also warn against dismissing them as fiction. Myth exists in the space between fact and meaning. It is not data, it is compression, centuries of observation condensed into narrative form. When the same story appears independently, across cultures, it suggests shared experience, not shared imagination, not coordination, convergence, and convergence demands explanation. Some explanations are environmental. Rapid climate shifts at the end of the last ice age reshaped coastlines worldwide. Entire populations were displaced. Agricultural systems collapsed. Cultural memory encoded these disruptions as divine intervention. Other explanations are astronomical. Large impacts, solar storms, and orbital shifts have demonstrable effects on Earth's environment. These events are rare, but not singular, and rarity is precisely what makes cycles hard to perceive. A cycle that spans thousands of years feels like coincidence to a single lifetime, but to a civilization that measures time differently, it becomes expectation. This is why ancient warnings rarely specify dates. They specify conditions: when the sky changes, when the waters rise, when order fractures. These are not predictions, they are recognition markers. So, when modern instruments detect anomalies, whether in seismic patterns, atmospheric chemistry, or interstellar signals, the ancient framework offers a different way of listening, not asking, what is happening now? But asking, has this happened before? This does not mean ancient cultures foresaw modern technology. It means they observed recurring disruption and learned how to remember it. And memory, when stripped of technical detail, becomes symbolic. The danger lies in overinterpretation. Not every cycle implies intent. Not every repetition implies guidance. But dismissing cycles entirely is equally dangerous, because patterns do not require intelligence to matter. They require acknowledgement. As researchers study ancient texts alongside modern data, the most responsible conclusion is not that ancient civilizations predicted our moment. It is that they lived through versions of it, and they left behind not instructions, but reminders. That upheaval is not random. That change is not singular. That silence does not mean safety, and that when warnings arrive, they are rarely understood until after they are needed, which brings us back to the present, to modern systems designed to listen far beyond Earth, to data fragments that arrive late, incomplete, and difficult to interpret, and to the uncomfortable realization that perhaps the challenge is not whether we are receiving messages, but whether we recognize cycles when they return. Because if ancient cultures encoded memory to survive collapse, what does it mean that we are trying to decode meaning before collapse arrives? And are we prepared to hear warnings that were never meant to be precise? Those questions lead us deeper, not into myth, but into human behaviour, because the way we rebuild after silence may be the most telling pattern of all. When the noise stops, humans do not freeze, they rebuild. This is one of the most consistent patterns in our archaeological record, yet it is rarely discussed in the same breath as catastrophe or collapse. We tend to focus on the moment of destruction, the flood, the fire, the climate shift, the sudden abandonment of cities, but the more revealing story begins afterward, in the silence that follows. Across continents and time periods, archaeologists observe a recurring phenomenon. After large-scale disruption, human societies do not resume exactly where they left off. They simplify, they condense, they preserve fragments, not systems. The tools change, the architecture becomes smaller, the symbolism becomes heavier. This is not regression, it is adaptation. Consider the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,700 years ago. Glacial retreat altered coastlines, river systems, and habitable zones at a pace unprecedented in human history. Entire populations were forced inland. Coastal settlements, now submerged, were abandoned permanently, yet within a few millennia, monumental architecture appears. Göbekli Tepe rises. Without agriculture, stone circles are erected before permanent cities. Symbolic complexity precedes economic complexity. This sequence is the opposite of what modern intuition expects. We assume stability creates culture. The archaeological record suggests the inverse. Disruption creates meaning. After collapse, humans seem to prioritize remembrance over efficiency. Why? Because survival alone is not enough. Memory becomes a technology. In post-collapse societies, practical knowledge is often lost. Metallurgy fades, writing disappears, trade networks collapse, but stories remain. And those stories tend to focus on three things: what happened, why it happened, how to recognize it again. They are not manuals, they are warnings encoded as identity. Anthropologists refer to this as cultural compression, the process by which complex systems of knowledge are reduced to symbolic narratives that can survive periods of instability. This explains why ancient myths often appear vague or exaggerated when read literally. Their purpose was not precision, it was continuity. A technical explanation of climate oscillation would not survive a collapse. A story about angry gods might. And while modern readers dismiss the latter as superstition, they underestimate its function, because myth does not need accuracy to transmit relevance. It needs resonance. When people rebuild after silence, they do not ask what failed. They ask what must never be forgotten. This is why post-collapse cultures emphasize origins. They recount who came before. They retell how order was established. They frame survival as inheritance. In Sumerian tradition, kingship is described as descending from the heavens, not because rulers believed themselves extraterrestrial, but because authority needed legitimacy that transcended chaos. In Mesoamerican societies, each new age begins after the destruction of the previous one. Humanity is recreated, memory is reset, but not erased. In ancient China, the mandate of heaven is lost and regained. Collapse is framed as moral imbalance, not random disaster. Different cultures, same structure. Collapse is never meaningless. It is explained, encoded, and remembered. Modern archaeology reinforces this pattern. When settlements are abandoned abruptly, later reoccupation layers often show simplified layouts, reused materials, and heavy ritual presence. Shrines appear before workshops. Burial practices become more elaborate. The dead matter more after catastrophe. This is not coincidence. In unstable environments, lineage stabilizes identity, and lineage requires story. This brings us back to the idea of silence. Silence is not merely the absence of signal, it is the absence of explanation. When something ends without clarity, humans fill the gap with narrative. This is why periods following disruption produce myths that feel disproportionate to the event itself. The myth is not about the scale of destruction, it is about the scale of uncertainty. A flood that lasts weeks can generate a story that lasts thousands of years, not because water was impressive, but because meaning was threatened. In this context, warnings preserved in ancient texts begin to look less like predictions and more like survivorship bias. Only the stories that mattered enough to retell survived. And what mattered most was not how to build, but how to recognise danger. Archaeologists studying oral traditions among indigenous populations have found that some stories accurately encode geological events that occurred thousands of years earlier. Coastal flooding remembered in Australian Aboriginal narratives corresponds with post-glacial sea level rise. Volcanic eruptions are preserved in Pacific Island myths with remarkable geographical accuracy. These stories are not detailed, they are directional. They tell you what to watch for. Rising water, shaking ground, darkened skies. They do not tell you when, because timing cannot be preserved reliably across generations. Pattern can. This distinction matters deeply when modern listeners attempt to reinterpret ancient warnings through contemporary lenses. We look for dates. Ancient cultures looked for conditions. This is why rebuilding after silence follows a recognisable trajectory. First, survival, then memory, then meaning. Only later does complexity return. Modern societies invert this order. We preserve data before story. We preserve systems before symbolism, which raises an uncomfortable question. If modern civilization experienced a prolonged disruption, not extinction, but interruption, what would survive? Satellites would fall. Digital storage would degrade. Power grids would fail. But stories would persist. Not technical diagrams, not databases, narratives. And those narratives would likely frame the cause in ways that make sense emotionally, not scientifically. This does not make them false, it makes them human. This is why attempts to interpret ancient myths as literal technological accounts often fail. They miss the point. The point is not what was known. The point is what was remembered. When scholars analyse repeated motifs across post-collapse cultures, sky beings, returning judges, cycles of destruction, they often ask whether these represent contact or imagination. A more grounded interpretation is that they represent memory under constraint, not the memory of machines, the memory of conditions. This interpretation does not exclude extraordinary events, it contextualizes them. A meteor impact, for example, would be remembered as fire from the sky, a solar storm as divine wrath, a climate shift as moral collapse. The language changes, the pattern does not. So when modern systems detect anomalies, delayed signals, unexpected structures, The temptation is to map ancient narratives directly onto them. This is risky, because it projects meaning where caution is required. But ignoring the parallel entirely is equally risky, because it dismisses the most durable form of human knowledge we possess: memory. Not perfect memory, not precise memory, but persistent memory, the kind that survives silence. This is why the most important lesson from ancient rebuilding patterns is not what they believed, it is how they responded. They did not panic endlessly. They did not await rescue. They adapted. They simplified. They ritualized. They encoded warnings into identity, which suggests that even when humans face unknown forces, they default to agency. This has implications for how we interpret modern uncertainty. If late-arriving data challenges our models, the response is not immediate meaning-making. It is patience, because understanding arrives after reconstruction, not during collapse. This is the error modern narratives often make. They expect clarity at the moment of disruption. History shows clarity comes later, after silence, after rebuilding, after the story has had time to settle. Which brings us to a more unsettling consideration. If ancient warnings are memories of cycles and modern anomalies reflect incomplete understanding, what if the most important signals are not the ones arriving late, but the ones we misinterpret while trying to listen too soon? That question shifts the focus away from external forces and toward our own frameworks, because before we ask whether something is communicating with us, we must ask whether we understand how humans respond when meaning breaks down. And that takes us into the ethics of listening. Not listening for messages, listening for responsibility. Listening is never neutral. This is a truth that becomes clearer the farther we extend our reach, beyond borders, beyond history, beyond the earth itself. When humans listen, we do so with assumptions already in place. We expect meaning to behave in familiar ways. We expect answers to resemble questions. We expect signals to conform to intention. But deep listening challenges all of this. The ethics of listening do not begin when meaning is discovered. They begin when uncertainty appears. Modern scientific institutions are built on restraint. Data is verified, replicated, contextualized. Anomalies are questioned, not celebrated. This caution is not bureaucratic inertia, it is protection against misinterpretation, because once a signal is framed as meaningful, it cannot be unheard. This is why ambiguous data is often treated conservatively, not hidden, but deferred, not denied, but withheld from interpretation, until enough context exists to reduce harm. And harm, in this context, is not only physical, it is psychological. Human history is filled with moments when ambiguous signs were elevated prematurely, comets interpreted as omens, eclipses mistaken for judgment, natural disasters framed as punishment. In each case, meaning was imposed before understanding. The result was fear. Sometimes fear stabilized societies, more often it fractured them. Modern science exists, in part, to prevent this reflex, but this introduces a paradox. If institutions delay interpretation too long, they risk missing patterns that require long-term awareness. If they interpret too early, they risk creating narratives that outrun evidence. This tension defines the ethics of listening. When deep space systems detect anomalies, irregular signal behaviour, unexpected structure, or late arriving fragments, the first responsibility is verification. Engineers ask, is this instrumental? Is this environmental? Is this statistical? Only after these questions are exhausted does interpretation begin. But even then, interpretation is cautious, because meaning, once shared publicly, becomes cultural, and culture amplifies. This is why official statements about anomalies are often understated, not because they conceal truth, but because they understand how quickly uncertainty becomes belief. The public often mistakes caution for secrecy. In reality, it is accountability. There is a difference between withholding information and refusing to speculate. The latter is not suppression, it is discipline. This distinction becomes blurred in an age of instant communication, when raw data is shared widely without context. Interpretation fills the gap. The human mind is uncomfortable with silence. We seek narrative closure. This is why speculation thrives in ambiguous spaces. But speculation is not inherently harmful. It becomes harmful when it masquerades as certainty. Ethical listening requires clarity about what is known, what is unknown, and what is unknowable. This applies not only to scientific data, but to ancient records as well. When scholars approach ancient texts describing sky beings, returning judges, or cyclical destruction, they face similar ethical decisions. Do they interpret myth as metaphor, as memory, as imagination? Each choice carries consequences. Reducing myth to superstition dismisses lived experience. Literalizing myth risks misrepresenting culture. Ethical interpretation navigates between these extremes. It acknowledges that ancient people were observant, intelligent, and meaning-oriented, without projecting modern frameworks onto them. This is why serious scholarship avoids sensational claims about ancient visitors or cosmic messages, not because the ideas are offensive, but because evidence does not support definitive conclusions. However, restraint does not mean disengagement, it means patience. Listening ethically requires resisting the urge to conclude. This is countercultural. Modern narratives reward certainty. They reward clarity. They reward bold claims. But history rewards those who wait. This is evident in how societies respond to warnings. Warnings are rarely acted upon immediately. They are often understood only after consequences unfold. This does not mean warnings are useless. It means they operate on different timescales. An ancient myth warning of cyclical destruction is not meant to prevent a single event. It is meant to shape worldview. Likewise, anomalous data in modern systems may not demand immediate response. It may demand humility. The ethical challenge is recognizing when listening becomes projection. Humans are storytellers. When faced with uncertainty, we construct narratives that restore control. This is why ambiguous signals are so potent. They invite meaning, and meaning, once attached, spreads faster than evidence. Ethical listening therefore requires restraint, not only from institutions, but from individuals. It asks us to sit with discomfort, to accept that some questions cannot be answered immediately, to resist the desire for closure. This does not mean disengagement. It means attentiveness without conclusion. The most responsible listeners are not those who hear the loudest, but those who interpret the slowest. This principle applies equally to ancient warnings and modern anomalies, when ancient cultures encoded cycles of destruction into myth. They were not predicting dates. They were cultivating awareness. They were teaching future generations how to recognize imbalance. Modern systems, by contrast, often aim to predict and prevent. These approaches are not incompatible, but they require integration. Ethical listening bridges them. It asks, what patterns persist across time? What assumptions shape interpretation? What responsibilities accompany awareness? These questions do not produce immediate answers. They produce frameworks that guide response when clarity emerges. This is why the ethics of listening matter, because listening is not passive, it shapes action. If ambiguous data is framed as threat, fear follows. If it is framed as mystery, curiosity follows. If it is framed as noise, dismissal follows. Each framing influences behaviour. The ethical responsibility lies not in choosing the right interpretation, but in acknowledging the consequences of interpretation itself. This is especially important when dealing with narratives that suggest humanity is not alone, or that past civilizations experienced intervention. These ideas challenge foundational assumptions. Handled responsibly, they invite reflection. Handled irresponsibly, they invite panic or dogma. History shows us that societies rarely collapse from lack of knowledge. They collapse from misapplied certainty. This is why listening ethically means accepting uncertainty as part of understanding. Not all silence hides meaning. Not all anomalies demand explanation. But some require patience. And patience is a moral stance. It resists sensationalism. It resists fear. It resists the need to dominate uncertainty with narrative. In the context of deep space data and ancient warnings, ethical listening asks us to remain grounded, to remember that interpretation is a human act, and humans are fallible. This does not diminish inquiry, it strengthens it, because inquiry grounded in humility endures. As the fragments accumulate, whether in data streams or ancient texts, the question is not whether meaning exists. The question is whether we are prepared to encounter it responsibly. And responsibility begins with understanding not what we hear, but how we listen. This realization does not end the inquiry. It redirects it, from external signals to internal frameworks, from messages to meaning-making, and from speculation to reflection, which leads us to the next layer of this exploration, because history offers numerous examples of warnings that were understood only after the moment had passed. Moments when clarity arrived too late to prevent consequences, but not too late to inform the future. That pattern too repeats, and it deserves careful examination. History rarely announces itself clearly in advance. It leaves traces instead, and most of those traces only make sense in hindsight. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths embedded in both archaeology and science, that warnings are often present but rarely recognised as such until after consequences unfold. Not because people are foolish, but because meaning depends on context, and context is usually incomplete in the moment. When ancient societies recorded moments of upheaval, they did not always understand what they were witnessing. They described what they saw, not what caused it. The sky darkened, the ground shook, the waters rose, the seasons shifted. Only later did these observations solidify into narratives of judgment, cycles, or returning forces. Modern researchers encounter a similar pattern when examining historical disasters. Take the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. Roman accounts describe earthquakes, strange clouds, and falling ash. Yet these signs were not interpreted as imminent catastrophe. They were understood only afterward, once Pompeii was buried. Or consider the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions roughly 12,900 years ago. Evidence of abrupt cooling exists in ice cores, sediment layers, and fossil records. But for the human populations living through it, the shift would have appeared as inexplicable environmental instability. No warning system existed, only experience and memory. Some scholars propose that ancient flood myths and sky event legends reflect memories of these abrupt transitions, not exact records, but compressed recollections of environmental trauma passed down through generations. The key point is not whether every myth corresponds to a specific event. It is that humans recognized instability before they could explain it. The warning was not the cause. The warning was the pattern. This distinction is often lost in modern discourse. We assume that a warning must be explicit to be valid, that it must arrive with clarity and actionable instruction. History suggests otherwise. Warnings often arrive as ambiguity. They are recognized not by precision, but by repetition. In modern times, scientists encounter the same dilemma. Climate data accumulated for decades before widespread acknowledgement of its implications. Early measurements existed. Models suggested trends. But interpretation lagged behind evidence, not because data was hidden, but because meaning was deferred. The consequences were not immediate, so urgency did not emerge. This is not a failure of science. It is a reflection of human psychology. We prioritize the present over the abstract future. We respond to certainty, not probability. This pattern repeats across domains. Early warning signs of pandemics, early indicators of ecosystem collapse, early anomalies in technological systems. They are rarely acted upon decisively until disruption becomes undeniable. By then, interpretation shifts rapidly. What was once dismissed as noise becomes signal. What was once ambiguous becomes obvious. But always after the fact. This retrospective clarity creates a dangerous illusion that warnings were ignored intentionally. In reality, they were misunderstood. This matters deeply when considering both ancient texts and modern anomalies. When ancient cultures describe returning gods or cyclical destruction, they may not have known what was coming. They only knew that something had come before. Likewise, when modern instruments detect anomalies, late signals, unexpected structures, unexplained patterns, the temptation is to ask why they were not recognized sooner. But recognition depends on framework, and frameworks evolve slowly. The ethical challenge is acknowledging that hindsight is not foresight. We cannot judge ancient interpretations by modern standards, nor can we assume modern interpretations are immune to error. This humility is essential, because history shows that understanding often arrives after impact. This does not render warnings useless. It reframes their purpose. Warnings are not guarantees of prevention. They are opportunities for recognition. They prepare minds, not outcomes. Ancient warnings preserved memory so that future generations might recognize recurrence. Modern warnings preserve data so that future analysts might reinterpret significance. Both operate on delayed timelines. This convergence is striking. When scholars examine ancient records alongside modern scientific data, they often notice parallel structures, not in content, but in function. Ancient myths encode instability as narrative. Modern telemetry encodes instability as anomaly. Both require interpretation. Both resist immediate clarity, and both are vulnerable to misreading. The danger lies not in exploring these parallels, but in conflating them prematurely. Responsible inquiry maintains separation while allowing dialogue. It asks, what can ancient memory teach us about recognizing patterns? What can modern science teach us about resisting projection? These questions do not yield dramatic conclusions. They yield discipline. Discipline in listening, discipline in interpreting, discipline in waiting. This is perhaps the hardest lesson, because waiting feels like inaction. But history shows that patience often precedes understanding. The most enduring insights are rarely the loudest. They emerge quietly, often long after the moment they describe. So when ancient texts speak of warnings that were ignored, or when modern systems register anomalies that defy explanation, the appropriate response is not alarm. It is attention. Attention without conclusion. Attention without narrative inflation. Attention that allows meaning to emerge over time. This does not satisfy curiosity immediately, but it preserves integrity, and integrity is what allows future understanding to build upon present uncertainty. Which leads us to the final layer of this exploration. Not a new mystery, but a reframing of all that has come before. Because if warnings are often understood too late, what does it mean to listen now, knowing that clarity may not arrive in time to change outcomes? but may still shape what comes after, that question does not demand urgency. It demands reflection, and reflection, in turn, reshapes how we understand silence itself. Because silence may not be absence, it may be preparation. And what follows silence, if history is any guide, is not ending, but renewal, not resolution, but continuation. Silence is often mistaken for an ending. In human experience, silence feels like closure, an absence that confirms something has finished. A voice stops, a signal fades, the screen goes dark, we move on. But history suggests something different. Silence is rarely the end of a process. More often, it is the space between phases. In archaeology, silence appears as a gap in layers, a break in habitation, an interruption in material continuity. These gaps are not empty, they are transitional. Something ended, yes, but something else began, forming quietly beneath the surface. The same pattern emerges in astronomy and deep space science. When a signal disappears, it does not vanish instantly. It degrades, it fragments, it lingers at the threshold of detectability before receding entirely. Engineers know this well. The final transmissions from distant probes are rarely dramatic. They fade into ambiguity. This fading is not failure, it is physics, and physics has no concept of meaning, only consequence. Yet humans experience silence emotionally. We interpret it. We assign significance to what is no longer heard. This is where silence becomes dangerous. Because when something stops responding, humans instinctively fill the gap. They speculate. They project. They narrate. This instinct is ancient. In oral traditions, when gods ceased speaking, prophets arose. When signs disappeared, interpretations multiplied. Silence became evidence, not of absence, but of concealment. But silence itself communicates nothing. It is we who speak into it. This distinction matters profoundly when interpreting both ancient records and modern anomalies. Consider the period following the collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE. Archaeological layers show a sudden decline in urban centres, coinciding with prolonged drought. Administrative texts disappear. Monumental inscriptions cease. For centuries, scholars debated what caused the collapse. Invasions, internal revolt, divine punishment. The truth emerged slowly through climate data, soil analysis, and comparative archaeology. The collapse was environmental, but the silence afterward was cultural. People survived, but their voices changed. They stopped building cities and began telling stories. Silence followed complexity, not because humanity ended, but because it reorganized. The same can be said for periods following major astronomical or environmental events. Tree ring data, ice cores, and sediment records show abrupt changes. Human responses appear fragmented, simplified, adaptive. Silence does not erase humanity, it reshapes it. So when we encounter silence in modern systems, whether a deep space probe that no longer transmits, or a data stream that abruptly changes character, the instinct to interpret silence as finality must be resisted, because silence is rarely static. It is dynamic absence. In the case of conceptual missions like 3i Atlas, the idea of final whispers captures this ambiguity, not because a message was necessarily sent, but because perception changed. Fragments arrived after expectation had ceased. Meaning became possible only in retrospect. This is not unprecedented. In radio astronomy, transient signals appear briefly and vanish. Fast radio bursts, for example, were once dismissed as instrumentation errors. Only after repeated detection did their astrophysical nature become accepted. Even now their origins remain debated. Silence framed interpretation. So did repetition. The key lesson is not that silence hides intent. It is that silence forces patience. And patience changes understanding. Ancient cultures understood this instinctively. When the gods fell silent, they did not assume abandonment. They assumed waiting, waiting for return, waiting for renewal, waiting for balance. This does not imply expectation of rescue. It implies recognition of cycles. Silence marks the turning of the wheel. Modern science, grounded in linear progress, struggles with this framing. We expect signals to end conclusively. We expect closure. But the universe does not provide narrative satisfaction. It provides continuity. Silence, in this sense, is not the absence of information, but the absence of immediacy. Information may exist beyond our current interpretive capacity. This is not mysticism, it is epistemology. What we cannot yet understand appears silent. What we misinterpret appears noisy, and what we understand appears meaningful. The danger is assuming that meaning must announce itself. History teaches us otherwise. Meaning accumulates. It emerges gradually, often, long after the moment it describes. This is why ancient warnings are not precise, and modern anomalies are not immediately intelligible. Both exist in temporal displacement. They are out of sync with understanding. This does not diminish their value. It defines it. So when silence follows data, or collapse follows civilization, or myth follows catastrophe, the pattern is consistent. Silence is not emptiness. It is transition. And transitions are where meaning reorganizes. The question then becomes not what was the message, but what does silence prepare us to become? Ancient cultures responded to silence by rebuilding differently. They preserved memory over mechanism. They encoded caution into story. Modern societies respond to silence with analysis, with models, with hypotheses. Neither response is superior. They serve different contexts. But both acknowledge that silence is not inert. It exerts pressure. It demands interpretation, even if that interpretation is restraint. So as the final fragments fade, whether from distant instruments or ancient texts, the responsible posture is not conclusion. It is readiness. Readiness to reinterpret. Readiness to revise. Readiness to listen again. Because history shows that after silence, something always follows. Not always catastrophe, not always revelation, but change. And change, when recognized early enough, becomes understanding. This brings us to the final reframing, not a new mystery, but a quieter realization, one that reshapes everything that has come before. When all the fragments are laid out, the delayed signals, the ancient cycles, the silences that followed collapse, what remains is not an answer. It is a posture. Human history does not suggest that meaning arrives cleanly, or even in time. It suggests something more restrained and more demanding. That meaning is shaped by how we listen. Ancient civilizations did not leave behind clear instructions for the future. They left warnings that were only legible to those willing to notice patterns rather than events. They did not try to stop cycles. They tried to remember them. Modern science does something similar, though in a different language. Data is preserved. Anomalies are archived. Unresolved questions are left open. Not because scientists expect revelation tomorrow, but because understanding often arrives later, carried forward by those who revisit what was once dismissed as noise. This is the quiet continuity between ancient record and modern observation. Not prophecy, not communication, but persistence. We often ask whether humanity is alone, whether messages are being sent, whether someone or something wants to be heard. But history suggests a subtler truth. The universe does not rush to explain itself. It repeats. Patterns emerge slowly. Signals degrade gradually. Meaning accumulates over generations, not moments. Ancient cultures encoded this understanding into myth because myth could survive silence. Modern institutions encode it into archives because archives can be reopened. Both assume the same thing, that someone someday will be listening more carefully. Perhaps that is the most enduring inheritance humanity carries, not knowledge, but attentiveness, the capacity to notice when something feels out of place, the patience to sit with uncertainty, the humility to admit when interpretation must wait. If there is a warning embedded in either ancient texts or modern anomalies, it may not be about catastrophe at all. It may be about posture, about resisting certainty when evidence is incomplete, about avoiding panic when patterns are emerging but not yet understood, about recognizing that silence is not dismissal, it is an interval. Intervals are where civilizations decide what they value. Do they preserve memory or overwrite it? Do they simplify or distract? Do they listen inwardly or search endlessly outward? The record suggests that societies which endure are not those that predict collapse, but those that adapt to uncertainty without losing coherence. Ancient myths did not prevent floods or fires, but they preserved orientation. They told future generations, this has happened before. Watch for it. Do not assume permanence. Modern science, at its best, does the same. It does not promise certainty. It offers models that evolve. It keeps questions alive rather than closing them prematurely. This shared restraint between myth and method is easy to overlook, but it may be the most important continuity humanity has ever maintained, because the most dangerous moment is not when a signal appears. It is when we believe we have understood it completely. History shows that collapse often follows overconfidence, not ignorance. Silence, when approached with patience, prevents that. It slows interpretation, it forces humility, it keeps inquiry open. So if there are whispers, ancient or modern, their value is not in what they say, it is in what they demand of us: attention, discipline, memory. And perhaps that is why so many warnings across time arrive indirectly, not to command, not to frighten, but to remain, waiting for a listener capable of restraint. In that sense, humanity is not defined by whether it receives messages from beyond itself. It is defined by how it responds when certainty fails, whether it chooses panic or patience, narrative or nuance, closure or continuity. As the noise fades and silence stretches once more, we are left not with answers, but with responsibility. To remember that not everything meaningful announces itself loudly, that not every warning is urgent, and that understanding, when it arrives, often does so quietly, long after the moment it describes. And perhaps that's enough. Not resolution, but readiness, not certainty, but care. And the knowledge that listening, when done well, is already a form of wisdom. The silence remains.